This is Ian Williams from the Foreign Press Association in New York, and it gives a great deal of pleasure to me today, even more so than many of our other guests. I've had other guests who've been enjoyable. We've mentioned John Bolton in the past, but whose worldview I do not necessarily share. But with Eliot Higgins, I've just finished reading his book, We Are Bellingcat, and I found I did share a lot. We've been inadvertently engaged in many of the same battles for truth. And what I like about him is not just that not Bellingcat researches and goes into things, but it's the approach, which is just the facts, ma'am. He doesn't start off with a predilection that so-and-so said something, so it must be wrong, or so-and-so said something, so it must be right. He wants to research them all, and he's done it. So as you all know, Bellingcat has been involved in the Russian poisonings. I don't think we can even say the alleged poisonings anymore. They were poisonings and they were Russian. He's been involved in the downing of the airliner over Ukraine, looking at the background, in excruciating detail. In fact, it's quite worrying as I read his book to realize how much of a trail you leave just by merely existing with a computer and a telephone. So I'm going to go over immediately, as they say, without further ado, to Eliot to explain how he got. I think that's the best part. How did you get from being a computer gamer, a bored office worker doing computer gaming on the side, to being presumably on #1 on the Russian Secret Service's hit list?
Yeah, I mean, it's basically just a hobby I had initially that really got out of hand. So I was back in 2010, I was kind of working in an office, doing kind of admin work every day. I've been doing that for, the past kind of 12 or so years. And I was someone who kind of grew up in the kind of 90s. I was started being a teenager with the first Gulf War, and then 2011 with 9/11, and that led to the 2003 invasion of Iraq. So for me, I think my teenage years were very much defined by kind of the US involvement in conflicts and kind of UK being kind of drawn into those conflicts. So I was always quite interested in kind of left-wing kind of approaches to those topics. So I was the sort of person who had Noam Chomsky and John Pilger and Seymour Hersh and Robert Fisk, those kind of books. And kind of as I was growing up, I was always interested in that kind of area, but also as someone who spent a lot of time on the internet. And even from like the mid-90s, I was kind of using kind of CompuServe and those kind of platforms, then moved on to using internet forums like the Something Awful forums, going on places then like the Guardian Middle East Live blog in 2010 when the Arab Spring was really getting going. And what was quite unique to me to that is how you could watch a live stream from like Tahrir Square as the security forces battled with protesters over hours and hours, and kind of just
in Cairo. We should explain to anyone who's not up on geography. Tahrir Square.
Yeah, so in Egypt, so during the Arab Spring in Egypt, you could watch the live stream kind of battles between protesters, and then I was kind of just commenting online about it. And when it came to Libya, there were more videos coming from the ground, and a lot of debate about these videos, whether or not they were genuine or not. I think the media had got a bit scared after a few kind of scandals, like there was a blog called Gay Girl in Damascus that was being cited quite a bit in the media, and it turned out to be some guy in the US just pretending to be a gay girl in Damascus, and it turned into like a huge string. And I think that had a real impact on the way the media saw content coming from these kind of Arab Spring countries. So even when there were videos and photographs, there were I think they were a bit scared about using it. Yeah, it seemed really interesting to me. There was stuff there showing, rebel groups capturing towns or arms depots getting overrun, where there was stuff that was interesting in there, but it wasn't really being taken seriously or even used. The people who were really discussing it were the people in the comments under these, like the Guardian Live blog, where I was talking a lot, or on the Something Awful forums, who would kind of share it and then kind of argue whether or not it was genuine. And I thought, well, can we actually figure out what is genuine in these videos? And there was a video that came from a place called Tiji in Libya. And it was significant because the rebels had claimed they had captured this town, and having followed the conflict like every single day and reading all the comments and tweets and YouTube videos and basically everything there was in English about what was happening in Libya, it was significant because it showed the rebel group in that area had pushed out of their frontline positions they'd been holding on for weeks. So I saw this video. It was a video that showed a tank running down this road in the center of this town. The road was about 2 lanes wide with a central divider. It was next to a mosque with a dome and a minaret. And I thought, well, let's see if I can see it on Google Maps. So I went to Google Maps, I searched for TG in Libya, which took me right there. There was satellite imagery of it. And very clearly there was one major road running through this quite small town. I zoomed into that and I could see it was wide enough to have, certainly a tank on it. There were like cars visible showing it was 2 or 3 lanes wide, plus it's a central divider splitting it into 2 sections. So I followed that along and there was a mosque on the road with a dome and a minaret. And then I went back to the video and looked at the smaller details, like the wall that went around the building, or the curve of the road, or the position of buildings and trees. And as I looked at the satellite imagery, I realized it matched perfectly. And that was kind of early 2011 when I stumbled into this idea of what we now call geolocation. And I basically did it to kind of win an argument on the internet. So it kind of just was a really strange kind of way for me to figure out how to, figure out what was going on. So then I posted that on the blog and people said, oh, I was wrong and I was an idiot and I should go away. And then I just kept doing it. It became like a hobby for me, just like finding these videos and figuring out where they were filmed using satellite imagery. And because I was posting about it almost obsessively every single day, I was kind of training myself to do what was eventually a core skill in investigation. So eventually I decided I would kind of start a blog, really just to bring together the kind of ideas I had kind of come across, not to be like a journalist or an investigator, really just somewhere where I could write.
You weren't being paid for this, were you?
No, I was just doing this as a hobby, and I just wanted to see what I could, almost like, I mean, my daughter had been born a few months earlier and all my other hobbies had gone out the window. And I thought, well, if I do a blog, I can pick this up and put it down. And it's interesting to look at these videos in this way. And that was early 2012, which is when the kind of conflict in Syria had started to escalate. And because I didn't really know I didn't know any Arabic whatsoever at all. I was focused on these videos that were popping up online where like the rebel groups had certain weapons, and using resources online, I taught myself what those weapons were. And I started building up a bit of a following among people who were also interested in these videos and figuring out what they meant. And they would be kind of the odd journalist here or there, or someone working at an NGO like Human Rights Watch or Amnesty. Not many people, but we formed the kind of initial group of people interested in this open source investigation.
We've got a question here from Rolf Engelman, which I think is relevant. He says your work is impressive, but is my impression correct that it's in its work there is a special preoccupation with Russia-related stories? If so, might this have been influenced by your work for the Atlantic Council? And if I could follow on from that, I mean, you just mentioned several, I would say, former heroes of mine, Robert Fisk, Cy Hersh, Noam Chomsky. And I discovered whoever idols have feet of clay over the last 10 years, these have had feet of painted Russian red clay. They've continually erred on the side of Putin, thinking he's a nice, cozy figure, improving the world from the Kremlin. So without being on the side of Washington, I tend to share your obsession with them. But I mean, is that the way you came to it?
Well, really, it was almost a natural evolution of how, in fact, the entire open source community that formed around the Arab Spring actually developed. Because initially, it kind of develops particularly around what was happening first in Egypt. I mean, it's literally a handful of people who may have been live blogging, like Andy Carvin at NPR, for example. Then when I started blogging, it was focused on 2 things: the UK phone hacking scandal and what was happening in Syria. And it was just an extension of kind of the fact that, Libya had.
Can we just double back and remind people that the phone hacking scandal in Britain was because a Murdoch-inspired newspaper primarily was spying on the phones of individuals, prominent individuals, to get their private lives and broadcast them. This closed the biggest newspaper in the world. I believe it was the News of the World, and they're still paying hefty sums out to the victims. So, sorry, that was the hacking scandal. Yes.
So I was kind of just looking at these videos, and remember, this was just kind of like a hobby of mine. I had no intention for anyone to even bother reading my blog. I actually called it after a Frank Zappa song, Brown Moses, I was listening to when I had registered another account. So it was the Brown Moses blog, and everyone knew me as Brown Moses, and it was quite random. But over time, I started finding more and more interesting videos, like the first videos of cluster bombs, barrel bombs, and that kind of built up what I was doing with, built a reputation for me, and that led me to, kind of get more well known. So I kind of focused on Syria for those first 2 years. Then that led me to launching Bellingcat, because there was an increasing number of people who were interested in open source investigation, wanted to learn how to do it, and also asked me if they could contribute stuff to my blog. And I thought, well, I'll start a news site where I can kind of have the resources for people to learn how to do it themselves and, submit articles. So that was July 14th, 2014, when I launched Bellingcat. Then 3 days later, MH17 was shot down in eastern Ukraine. What happened then is, this was all crowdfunded. I mean, I launched Bellingcat with £60,000 from Kickstarter, and but MH17, in a sense, before we just had a community of open source investigators who were pretty much only looking at Syria, because that's where we kind of all emerged from, in a sense. But then you had this kind of community emerge around Ukraine and what was happening there. And that community, was just made up of people online, on social media, just ordinary people, but some who knew the work of Bellingcat. So what started happening then is, this is literally within days, I started seeing certain people who were on Twitter and finding good stuff and actually doing some of their own analysis using the kind of things I've been doing, like figuring out where these missile launches that were filmed and photographed were in Ukraine. And we kind of formed a group around that, just kind of an informal working group, just all interested in the same subject. And over the next weeks, we'd form like a team, basically, just looking at the videos and stuff that was coming from Eastern Ukraine. Then that just led us to more and more kind of discoveries about what was happening, not only with MH17, the fact that the missile launcher came from Russia, and we all went into this just wanting to know what happened. If the missile launcher was Ukrainian and shot down MH17, we'd have written about that, but that wasn't the case. So we worked on that, for a while, and we discovered more then about Russia's involvement in the conflicts in Ukraine itself. So that expanded our kind of understanding of the conflict, and again focused on Russia, just because that was kind of the natural kind of movement of the community. Then with Russia started bombing Syria in 2015, and that kind of brought everyone from the kind of Syrian Ukraine open source community kind of together. So it's kind of just the natural evolution of what was happening. And then we kind of accidentally, it was almost by accident, we discovered the stuff about the Skripal poisoning, because one of our colleagues, Christo Grozov, had an idea that you could kind of, he had these leaked Russian databases that had been floating around, looked at the two suspects and discovered they didn't exist in 2012, but they did exist in 2013. And seeing they were clearly not 5 years old, there was something suspicious. And then that kind of just led to that. Of course, all throughout this, Russia has been really annoyed with us. So they're constantly kind of pushing back against us and attacking us. So we're constantly in a position where we have to, they say, well, this is completely untrue. And we have to prove, no, actually, we've done the research, we've verified the evidence. So that's kind of why the Russia's been focus has been there.
I understand you had the ultimate accolade that you've just become a non-person in Russia. Your photograph hasn't started disappearing off portraits yet, but
Russian state
you don't exist.
Yeah, Russian state media, there was an article in RIA last week where they wrote that Eliot Higgins didn't exist, and there's no evidence that my wife or children exist, which my children were very surprised about when I told them. I said,
there goes the child support.
I said I couldn't homeschool them anymore because they didn't exist. So Russia said so. But that's kind of, they've called us CIA, MI6, MI5. They've called us amateurs, but now they've kind of unpersoned me. So there's been a kind of escalation there all the way through.
Were you sort of you were tangentially at least involved in a campaign of vilification against the white helmets in Syria? You were defending. I mean, the Russians really went full, and their allies across the world went full court on presenting the white helmets in Syria, the people who tried to rescue Assad's victims from the rubble, as CIA, MI5, MI6, MI whatever agents. Could you care to comment on that or give some background?
Yeah, it depends how deep you want to go in the subject. So there has, Russia obviously doesn't like the white helmets because they're presenting evidence of, war crimes and other information. But often we kind of, when we talk about disinformation, it's so often framed as Russia doing something to us. But really with the kind of anti-white helmet stuff, they were amplifying a pre-existing community that had existed for a long time. It was made up of many people who had a distrust of the West, in particular because of the invasion of Iraq in 2003. They felt that
Understandable,
everything
yes.
was basically an extension of what had happened in 2003. If the West was interested in the Middle East, it's because they wanted to invade and take all the oil again. So they kind of, and you find this with all sorts of communities online on a whole range of different subjects. Really at the core of it is a fundamental distrust in traditional sources of authority, be they the government or media, based off kind of, often valid kind of betrayals of trust, like the invasion of Iraq in 2003, where the UK and US and the media and the government lied and basically brought us into a conflict that's had devastating consequences to the whole region. So, but these people really see their entire worldview through that perspective. And it's not just unique to the invasion of Iraq. It can be stuff, related to kind of coronavirus. You find a lot of the coronavirus conspiracies are coming from people through the kind of alternative health community who have a distrust in kind of mainstream kind of medical authority. And often those people, or some of those people in those communities, are then drawn into kind of vaccine conspiracy theories. And it's not like you distrust doctors, therefore you're a vaccine conspiracy theorist. There is almost a process of radicalization in these kind of counterfactual communities that start forming online. It's the same as well for things like the flat earth movement. You might click on a video thinking the flat earthers are funny, but 1 in 10,000 people will watch the video and say, actually, that's interesting, and keep clicking on another and another that's helpfully served to them by Google or, whichever social media platform, thanks to the algorithm deciding they want to know about the earth being flat. And you end up with this kind of process of online radicalization around a whole range of different topics. And I think really those communities see themselves in opposition to these traditional sources of authority that they see as the enemy. They see, I've been let down by the media, the government, they've betrayed, what I believe in, therefore they're bad and should be destroyed. And anyone who doesn't agree with me is either a dupe or proactively part of that deception. And the white helmets thing is really something that has, taken hold within a certain kind of community. And that then was really amplified by the Russian Federation. Certain personalities within that kind of counterfactual community, this alternative media ecosystem, were kind of taken to the UN to talk about how awful the white helmets were, or constantly appear on things like Russia Today, or are cited by Russian officials at a whole range of different bodies. So, I do get frustrated when there is this discussion about disinformation that is so often focused on what someone is doing to us rather than what we're doing to ourselves as a society.
Well, somebody here has raised the question, Eric Bergen, how do you go about verifying the findings from researchers on the network? Eric admits it's often hard to get things confirmed from official sources. I mean, you operate on a sort of distributed peer review system, really, don't you?
Yeah,
you don't have a jury or a voter. You don't have a, okay, ladies and gentlemen, electronic jury, is this story true or false?
Yeah, I mean, the thing is, it's kind of different levels of engagement. But say someone comes to us with an article saying, oh, I've done this investigation and will you publish it? We'll go through that and we'll look. The thing with open source evidence is you should be able to link to the evidence you're using. If you've got a YouTube video, you link to it. It's simple. And then if you're saying, oh, I've geolocated it to this location, that process is also transparent. So we can check it that way. So the thing that makes this work quite unique, and it's really comes from the, when I started doing this, I knew that there was no reason anyone should trust anything I was saying because I was just some idiot on the internet. So I was always very transparent about the sources and the processes that I used for my investigations. So even if, anytime someone comes to us with a claim, or they want something published, or they think they found something, there's a transparent process they can go through to prove it to us. And if they haven't done that, then we tell them to go away and do that. And if they don't do it, then we know not to trust what they're doing. And then we can double check stuff quite easily. If it's so, it makes it difficult for bad information to put into that network. Even when we were working on the recent stuff, examining the assassinations and the Skripals and the Navalny's and all the other assassinations that's been going on, that was using information that was basically coming from sources in Russia, the kind of Russian information market. And there, this wasn't open source material in the traditional sense, but it was so endemic that we actually wrote an article explaining how we did our investigations. And then whilst the Russian government was saying we got it from the CIA, Russian media went out and used the same data markets and found the same data from different sources as well that was matched exactly to what we had been saying. So even though it wasn't like a YouTube video or something that anyone could find in 2 seconds, it was still so open that people could still go and buy the same information and confirm our findings. So we're always trying to have, as if possible, a way to be as transparent as possible about our sources. We aren't saying this person has told us this thing. Where even when we're buying, this kind of data from these Russian data markets, if we buy, for example, someone's phone records and there's a phone number on there they've called that's of interest, we'll actually go and buy from a separate source the phone records for that other person and then make sure they match correctly. So we usually try and have 2 or 3 kind of separate sources for each kind of claim that we're making in these articles, rather than just saying we've got this one source that tells us this thing, because we know in these, especially in the case with the Russia stuff, that the Russian government does going and change data specifically in reaction to the work that we're doing. So we do have to make sure everything's verified and fact checked.
You're sort of treading on for what for some traditional journalists will be a thin line here. Buying private telephone data is considered to be unethical, no matter what the end result is. We accept the governments do it all the time and probably don't pay for it, but you doing it, for many journalists, would strike just a little over the top. How you've had this debate with them? How do you answer them?
So, I mean, this was a debate we had internally when we first started doing this. It really started with the Skripal investigation, where one of our colleagues, Christo Grozev, he's, among information he'd been gathering over the years, he had these leaked databases that of, you could go to a market in Russia 10 years ago and buy them on a DVD, and they were turning up on torrents and, stuff like that on the internet. So he had some, and he looked up the 2 suspects who were, presenting themselves as being sports nutrition salesmen who came to Salisbury to see the 123-meter spire on Russia Today, and discovered that in the 2013 databases he had, like house registrations, they existed. But in the 2012 database, they didn't exist at all. They just come into life from nowhere in 2013. And that was really suspicious. And, we're talking about nerve agent being used in a British town to assassinate people. And, like Charlie Rowley, who was the partner of Dawn Sturgis, who died from being exposed to Novichok after he found a sealed perfume bottle inside a bin and gave it to her thinking it was a perfume, and it was actually filled with Novichok. That, if he had been walking down the street and dropped it on the floor, he could have, poisoned half the town with that Novichok. It was, irresponsible is a light word to say what was happening there. So the other thing we thought as well is, if we expose who these people are, it'll make it impossible for them to fly around Europe poisoning people. So for us, there was also, on the other flip side of the ethical coin, the fact that we knew we could get this data, and by not doing it, that could actually result in more people being assassinated with nerve agents. But then that just kind of turned into like this endless. I mean, the Navalny thing we did recently was basically just an extension of what we started in 2018, because that research on the Skripals led us to another assassination attempt in Bulgaria in 2015, linked to more of these GRU officers. That then took us to a nerve agent lab, a secret nerve agent program in Russia, that we identified the scientists who had been working on the old Novichok program, basically went on to work in these other places, that one of which supposedly made sports nutrition, just like the Skripal assassins said they were doing. So I don't know if that was an in-joke, but that was like a weird moment. So when Navalny was poisoned, we just checked these people's phone records, and they'd been calling an FSB team, who we then discovered had been following him 40 times. And now we discovered have followed numerous Russian opposition figures and also non-political figures who died under mysterious circumstances or fell extremely ill under mysterious circumstances. And we're still finding more of these cases. And it's like, okay, where do we draw the line where it says, okay, this isn't ethical to do anymore, because we are revealing a massive Russian state-sponsored assassination program using an illegal nerve agent program, which seems to us like significant enough that it's justified. But we've continually had a kind of ethical debate, because with Bellingcat as well, we're a bit unusual in that we're a charitable foundation. So we have a supervisory board we have to kind of justify our acts to, and, you know, have these ethical discussions with as well. So, you know, top to bottom, we're having these discussions. This isn't kind of like, you know, an organization where I'm the king of Bellingcat and I get to decide what we do. We have to justify it to like our board of directors and our supervisory board. So it's something we have a lot of debate about in the organization.
This, I mean, you can almost see why Putin's nostalgic for the good old days of Stalin. This information would not have been leaked in the good old days. I mean, the fact that the Soviet Union is, the Russians are so incompetent in protecting their sources, and B, the system is so permeable and transparent to you. It must be extremely galling to the old style apparatchiks in Moscow.
I mean, it really must be, but it's always been interesting for me how, I mean, Russia really does genuinely seem to think that we are part of the MI6 or the CIA. I've spoken to people from a variety of bodies at the UN and other places where they said they've spoken to Russian officials who've seriously told them that Bellingcat is working for the intelligence services or MI6. We had the Russian ambassador to the UK tell a room full of journalists that we are working for the British deep establishment and working with the intelligence services. And I think they genuinely believe this now. And that worries me a bit, because when we're publishing about all these Russian assassinations and the secret nerve agent program, it kind of logically follows that they must think that if we're publishing it, then it must be MI6 or the CIA telling us to publish it. And therefore the governments must know. But then when the governments only dispel a few diplomats and do a few lame sanctions, do they then think, well, the governments mustn't really care because their intelligence agencies have been instructed to reveal this information to the public, and now they're just doing a few lame sanctions, so let's keep murdering people because obviously they're not that bothered about it. So that kind of really worries me about this kind of the international reaction.
You certainly get that impression with Syria, because this week it's been in the Security Council, and the Irish ambassador, amongst many others, was saying, what type of body is this? They've been killing people in Syria for 10 years. You've been observing it. You've been finding nerve gas and chemical weapons in there, and you're doing absolutely nothing about it. That question was asked this very week, I believe, by several ambassadors in the Security Council. So you can quite understand why, you know, if nothing happens, did the tree really fall?
Well, yeah, this is the thing. I mean, I think personally for me, with Syria in particular, and chemical weapons is something I've worked on, you know, for a long time, and I'm very much part of the community now that's involved with the justice and accountability efforts, like the recent stuff that's happening in France about the August sarin attacks in Damascus. But the way that's been reported, I think the average person would probably think there's been 3 or 4 chemical attacks in Syria, whilst the reality is close to 300 or 400. And these are very, very well documented. I mean, not just through open sources, but there's a lot of information that has been gathered around these attacks that is really quite detailed. Yet it's been done on such a massive scale. And you wonder that, you know, if there's a perception from the Syrian government and the Russian government that our intelligence services are so great that they know everything and they know there's all these attacks going on, then the fact there's been no real reaction against, you know, 99% of the attacks seems to create this kind of permission structure. And that really worries me, because if that happens in Syria, then other countries might be seeing it the same way, that there's this massive amount of chemical weapon use that is acceptable as long as you're only killing a few people with it every time you're using it, but you can do it as much as you want.
Well, you've seen, we've seen in, I mean, sadly, you came along too late to deal with the Balkans, but the same type of misinformation was being used in the Balkans. Flat out denial, you know, 6,000 corpses at Srebrenica. Oh, you know, you're inventing it. They're made up. They just grew overnight. You know, the type of complete, utter denial by governments. But are you tempted to redeem yourself by doing a sort of blockbuster style Julian Assange job on the Pentagon or Washington?
The thing is, a lot of people say, why don't you do the same thing you're doing with Russia, with these spies, with the US? And you can't, because the US doesn't have all its data being leaked online, you know, as easy as, you know, popping down the shop to buy a bag of chips. It's kind of, you know, it's so available. There's so much leaking of information going on that the circumstances that allow us to do these kind of investigations are actually quite unique to Russia. And we have investigated stuff, that focuses on the US. We did a really big investigation into violence against Black Lives Matters protesters, for example. We've investigated a really horrific airstrike in Syria by US forces on a mosque that was filled with civilians, which the US claimed wasn't really a mosque, it was an Al-Qaeda meeting location, yet there were like women and children being pulled out of the building. And we've done a lot of work actually investigating, for example, Saudi airstrikes in Yemen, and we're doing that because Bellingcat isn't, although we're kind of considered as a journalism organization often by many journalists, we actually do a kind of a range of activities. So we do a lot actually with justice and accountability. So I've been working with the International Criminal Court's Technology Advisory Board on looking at the issue of using open source evidence in courts. And what's very unusual about this field is it hasn't emerged from a field of experts. It's emerged from a field of amateurs. And because this information is so valuable in accountability, there's questions about how you can actually use this evidence in courts. And so that's meant as almost like a frontline responder to the kind of incidents that are happening using open source information. Bellingcat has kind of found it's at the kind of leading efforts to turn what we do in investigations into a process that can be used for courts. So we focused on Saudi airstrikes in Yemen to begin with. We've done a couple of dozen investigations into Saudi airstrikes using a new process for archiving and investigation. And actually recently we had a mock trial with real lawyers and a real judge who'll be joining the ICC to test if this evidence can actually be used in court using the process we've developed. And once we kind of hone that process, the idea is that we'll document it and distribute it to other organizations who are working with open source evidence and any kind of future Bellingcat-like organizations that pop up, because there are a lot of questions about how you use open source evidence in trials, and there's been some movement towards it, but we found ourselves in this very strange position of being the ones who are actually gathering and analyzing it. And with bodies like the ICC, where they kind of been very slow to start an investigation, and now Facebook and YouTube takes this sort of content offline very, very quickly. In a way, the only way to capture and archive that content is by having groups, like Bellingcat collecting it first, but they have to collect it then in a way that's actually useful for courts. So, that it's a challenge then, as a small organization. I mean, we're 20 people, we have a budget of less than like 2 million euros a year, and we're trying to figure out this massive complicated problem, but we do that through engaging on a wide range of topics and a wide range of subjects. And it might seem that we write about Russia a lot, but we actually don't write about Russia as much as possible. It's just those individual Russia stories are so big that it kind of blots out all the other stuff that we're doing.
Question from Brazil, Roberto Peixoto. Do you think Bellingcat is a blueprint for digital investigative journalism? And which agencies, organizations do you think are using open source techniques shrewdly besides Bellingcat? I'd like to add to that, just as a sort of rider, since Roberto came from Brazil, the sort of shadow areas on the internet. Are the resources available? Like, take the Congo this week. The UN has consistently been sending officials to be killed on a road which everybody apparently locally knows is unsafe, and they're being assured it's safe. They've sent they've had investigators killed, they've had judges killed, and the investigators into the investigations have been killed. Is the net pervasive enough there for the same techniques to be used?
It could be. I mean, it can be used in a whole range of different subjects and all sorts of different areas, and also it's all kinds of different levels as well. It doesn't always have to be about kind of massive war crimes all over the place. One thing we try and do at Bellingcat is try and engage with a whole range of different types of organizations who might be able to apply open source investigation in their own work. Often that's kind of media organizations or kind of NGOs and activists. But we've been engaging with organizations in Latin America to working on projects in the killing of journalists in Mexico, for example, the Oscar Perez shooting that happened as well. That was another really big investigation we did. And we're also looking now as well, not just at looking at kind of, these kind of journalists and NGO trainings, but looking at younger people as well. There's a really interesting project in the UK called Student View, where they've been creating pop-up newsrooms for 16 to 18-year-olds in schools in deprived areas, teaching them how to do investigative journalism to look into their local area. And, this is exactly the perfect thing for Bellingcat's open source investigation, because that's something that's very teachable. And you're not only showing them how to do investigations, you're showing them how they can actually have an impact in their own area, and also connecting them to a network of people who can kind of promote their work in different ways and show them how to engage with that. And that's the kind of thing that I'm really interested in. It's not just about helping another organization. It's about connecting them to a network that allows them to work with, you know, different people in different ways. A lot of our work now is based off collaborative projects. We've just done one, for example, on Frontex, border pushbacks. The Frontex is basically the EU agency that's supposed to protect our borders, and they've been doing these border pushbacks in the Mediterranean, where what they'll do is they'll have migrant boats coming from, say, Turkey to Greece. They'll disable the engine and then use the wake of their boats to push them back into Turkish waters and hope they float back to Turkish shores, and kind of just leave them there. And if they don't float back, and they instead drown. And we did an investigation, which was a combination between a Japanese TV company, a German newspaper, Dutch journalism NGO, some volunteers who were just really interested in the topic. And because we had that kind of multi-pronged approach, it led to the EU starting an investigation into Frontex because of their activity and a lot of criticism of the organization. But by doing these collaborative projects and working across not just different countries, but also different fields, it can actually have a lot more impact than just saying, knocking something out on the Bellingcat website. So I always try and really encourage people to collaborate in as kind of wider range as possible, because I feel that really has a lot more impact.
Obviously, your work is murder and poison gas and assassinations are the sexy subjects, you might say. One of the biggest threats to the world economy today, from some points of view, is massive corruption and black money movements. Is this something you've dared to delve into yet? Because they'll probably be more ruthless than the Russians if you start poking.
Yeah, we've done some work. I mean, we did a really intense data project on the use of Scottish limited partnerships in the UK for suspicious financial activities, which is probably not worth explaining to an American audience, but it's kind of one of these things that, you know, the data's there, just no one ever bothers looking at it, and we just put someone on to look at it, and there was a lot of interesting stuff going there. Apparently lots of Russians and Ukrainians own companies in Scotland for some reason.
Like Robert Burns.
It's very, yeah, we've done stuff on that. I mean, you can use open source to investigate corruption in politicians by, you know, finding out, you know, often you'll find the in certain parts of the world where there is a lot of corruption, you'll find the kind of wives and girlfriends and children of these politicians are, you know, on Instagram taking, you know, photographs of all their expensive kind of jewelry and cars and holidays they're going on, whilst the person's earning like $10,000 a year officially. So you can use kind of open source investigation to do that as well. And we do have some other big projects in the works on corruptions. But I mean, you know, you have groups like the Organized Crime and Corruption Reporting Project who do really amazing work on that. We did a piece recently where we collaborated with a group focused on Kyrgyzstan and corruption there in the customs officials, which led to protests and some quite, you know, strong public reaction to that. So yeah, we do kind of work on all kinds of areas, and open source investigation really is applicable to all kinds of things. We've been doing recently conservation issues, looking at groups who are involved with illegal wildlife trades. We've done something more recently where we looked at how in Dubai there's a community of people who buy and sell basically baby wild animals, like, you know, tiger cubs, so they can be used in Instagram photographs. And there's like a whole trade in it, and it's like really, it's absolutely disgusting that it's for people just so they can pose with them and kind of look cool on the Instagram for their followers. But it happens a lot in Dubai, and even though it's supposedly illegal, they get away with it because it seems like some of the senior people involved with policing the wildlife trade are also involved with breaking the laws around the wildlife trade. So yeah, there's a whole range of things you can do. In fact, I don't get much chance to investigate at the moment. I mean, last year I was working on my book and running Bellingcat, but the one investigation I did do last year, which was very successful, was I was contacted by lostdog.co.uk, which is a group that looks for dogs that have been stolen. And they came to me saying, we've got this CCTV footage of a car that has a stolen dog in it. Can you look at it and figure out what it is? And there's a very blurry piece of footage and you couldn't read the number plate. But one of my colleagues, Timmy Allen, he had developed a process to use machine learning to decipher blurry number plates. And he developed this to investigate murders of police officers and journalists. But we applied it to this car that had stolen this dog and found that got the number plate. The police used it, went to the person's house who had owned the car, and the dog was in the garden barking away, and they rescued the dog. And that was like 10 minutes work, but it's reunited a family who had their animals stolen.
And I hope leads to a flood of donations from dog lovers for Bellingcat's charitable work.
So these techniques as well, when you develop these techniques, they can be applied to all kinds of different subjects, from stolen dogs to the murder of journalists. So by sharing it and propagating those ideas through a network as well, that's kind of makes it easier for other people to kind of achieve interesting findings in their own work.
Our colleague Frank Gomez almost touched on it. With the limitless number of possible areas of focus, how do you narrow them and select the ones you want to explore? Is it just an element of serendipity, like, passing dog lover calls you up?
I mean, it varies quite a bit. I mean, generally, my rule is that if people are interested in doing stuff as researchers, they can go off and do it, because they're the ones who are going to spend hours and hours looking at 10,000 Facebook pages to figure out the clue. And if they don't care about it, they aren't going to really enjoy that process. But within Bellingcat, we do have a kind of long-term strategy that is around developing ideas around justice and accountability. So we're looking for projects where we have an opportunity to do investigations that we can then use in work with legal organizations to see if we can use them in court. So that's why we're focusing on Yemen, because those investigations were actually used to challenge UK arms exports to Yemen, to Saudi Arabia rather. I mean, the UK just moved the goalposts of what they thought was acceptable when they saw our evidence, but the whole point was that we were trying to make this, and this is why we're testing it in court. So really now our staff know that we have these kind of broad goals, but even within that, they can have a huge scope of what they can do. I mean, it is frustrating though, because we are a small organization, and even with volunteers, when you're looking at stuff like war crimes, you do need quite a small group working on that, not least because there's issues of like vicarious trauma, but you also have to have a systematic evidence collection process, which makes it more work intensive and not something you can just kind of crowdsource online. And it's very frustrating when there's stuff that could be investigated in Sudan and Myanmar and all over, that we just don't have the resources to do, even though we're sure we could do huge amounts of work on those areas. But that's again why we train other people to do open source investigations. So there's a chance that even if we aren't able to do it, that someone else has the skills to actually do that.
Part of it is, I mean, I see a pattern developing as well, because you're finding information, but you're not able to get it out there in a way that has an effect. I mean, you mentioned the multiple chemical warfare attacks in Syria. You've mentioned some of the other incidents. What I don't remember is the headlines about them, or the questions asked in Parliament or Congress, or the various legislative bodies. What are you doing about this to the governments? You discussed the stuff in Yemen, and the Saudis are still dropping high explosives on Yemen, even if the British have now decided that they're not the defensive high explosives being dropped.
I mean, one sense, I mean, Syria is a kind of a weird one, because although there's not been a kind of direct impact, like an investigation has led to the UN doing something, there has actually been this in the justice and accountability community. Syria has kind of set the example of what you can potentially do with this kind of work. I mean, it's sad that we can't do a lot with the work in Syria, but for example, the Open Society Justice Initiative has just worked together with various organizations to put together a case in France against Syrian officials on the August 5th and 21st sarin attacks in Damascus in 2013. And that started by them talking to me about the open source evidence of these attacks. And they're doing more and more around these kind of attacks. And sometimes when, accountability isn't, it doesn't come fast sometimes. Other times, though, it can be surprisingly fast. A few years ago, there was a video shared online from somewhere in Africa. This is all we knew. It showed kind of this just somewhere, it could have been, you had no idea where it was. It was kind of in the countryside. There were a few kind of small structures, a dusty path, two women carrying two very young children on their back being marched down the road by a group of soldiers and then executed on the roadside. It was a really horrific video, and it's being shared on social media. At that time, we were doing a workshop with journalists in London, and we usually do 3 days of training of open source investigations and then 2 days of investigating stuff that they're interested in. And this video was what they were interested in. So in those 2 days, we managed to identify the weapons and uniforms as matching to those being used by a specific part of the Cameroonian army. And one of the journalists went on and did a piece on his ITV News in the UK, and then some journalists from the BBC picked it up and started asking questions of the Cameroonian government, who responded by giving a lengthy press conference where they had the video still with fake news written underneath it and explained step by step how it couldn't be Cameroonian, the guns aren't right, the soldiers, everything was wrong. That was, like a red rag to a bull to us. So we kind of formed a group that was people from Amnesty, Bellingcat, Conflict Arms Research, but some people from Twitter who were just really keen on looking at this video and had done a lot of work on it. And we figured out exactly where it was filmed, who the people were in the videos. That led to the Cameroonians having to put them on trial for murder. And a couple of months ago, they were convicted for those murders. So it is possible to have impact. And the sad thing is that only got looked at in that way because we were running a workshop where a bunch of people kind of came together and started looking at it. If it really hadn't been for that, there's a good chance that would have never been looked at, and those people wouldn't have found accountability for their actions. And for me, it kind of shows the potential of what you can do with this, but also frustrates me that we can only do it in a really small way because we're a tiny organization. And that's again why we try and spread the word about open source investigation as much as possible.
Well, as we in the FPA have discovered ourselves, if you have a good organization, people imitate you with pseudo ersatz imitations, not doing the job properly. So one of your problems is you want to replicate yourself because you're not holding on to intellectual property on this, are you? You're eager to push it out. So how do you make sure that as organizations emulate you, they operate on the same ethical standards?
It's difficult. I mean, we don't have that as too much of a problem at the moment because it tends to be quite small scale. And some of the organization, the thing is, you do have to make a real time commitment to do this work. It has to be all you do. So within the media, for example, it's been done most effectively by the New York Times and the BBC Africa Eye team, who are actually involved with the Cameroonian case, where they've had a team dedicated to this kind of investigation, although their outcome is purely kind of journalistic, whilst we have outcomes that are kind of headed. We have journalistic types, accountability types, we have a range of kind of goals with what we're doing with our investigation work. So it makes it quite difficult actually to have other organizations starting to do this because they do have to have that commitment and it needs resources. So what we do more and more is partner with other organizations who are kind of more traditional organizations in their field, be they human rights or journalists or whoever, and give them our kind of open source investigation experience as part of an investigation that allows them to do their kind of more traditional investigative work alongside what we're doing, combining our efforts and then having multiple outcomes, that allow us to kind of approach that problem, from different angles when we kind of come to the impact side of it. So it's difficult, but it's the thing is, I think in the open source community, we're quite happy to call out other people who are getting stuff wrong with open source investigations. So in a sense, we're self-policing, because I think a lot of open source investigators, especially the amateurs ones, if you're a professional organization and you mess up an open source investigation, by the transparent nature of it, the way in which stuff is geolocated and sources are shared, you will get called out on that by plenty of people on the internet. And because the open source investigation community it's growing, but it's still kind of everyone knows each other. So if you mess up in a really big way and publish something that's not true using open source investigation, you do get called out on it, and you will get called out on it publicly. So you have to be really careful about what you're doing as an open source investigator. Plus, you have a whole community of people in these counterfactual communities who are just waiting to tear you apart for the slightest mistake. So in a way, that kind of polices those organizations who might kind of do it the wrong way, because if they're publishing stuff.
I love your coinage, the counterfactual community, and you're sort of really belling the cat here, because you've been looking at Black Lives Matter and presumably January the 6th. But with Black Lives Matter, there were accusations and counter accusations. There were people who have now been revealed on Capitol Hill, who seem to have been involved in provoking some of the violence, which was alleged at the time but denied. Where did your work from there? How far has that gone?
On January 6th, God, I swear to God, I've watched about 1,000 videos from start to finish from January 6th. So since January 6th, because we're working at the moment of putting together a lot of information about it. I can't go into details at the moment, but it has involved me systematically watching every single video. So all the leaks parlor videos, all the ones that people shared on YouTube. What we actually did is, as soon as we saw that happening, we basically put out a call to our kind of followers on social media to send us any links they had with videos. And we collected a selection of about, I think we ended up about with 500 or 600 video links from a whole range of different sources. Then there were the Parler leaks, which were all the videos that were kind of geotagged to Washington, DC from Parler, which were another 500 or 600 videos. So about 1,000 videos in total showing all kinds of things that were happening, all kinds of perspectives. And then I've been working to put those into a timeline and figure out the kind of progression of events that were happening. What's been very interesting for me is the way in which the violence kind of escalated, really first coming from the police. The crowd was almost festive, and then the police were throwing flashbangs at head height into the densest parts of the cloud, which really upset the people in the crowd. But even then, this kind of escalation was quite gradual. And that doesn't really come across in a lot of the way that this has been reported. It was just that suddenly they descended on the Capitol, broke in and smashed everything up, but there was kind of more progression there. So it's kind of been very interesting for me to kind of look at that. On the other side as well, we do occasionally help law enforcement, like with the MH17 case, where we found a lot of open source evidence we shared with the Joint Investigation Team. We didn't do this in this case because, it's not our job to identify suspects involved with, or comparatively low level crimes. I mean, it's one thing to shoot down an airline of 298 people to it, but it's another to kind of assault a police officer, which is still bad, but not one where we aren't the police. It's not our job to do the job of the FBI and find the identities of people. And also we kind of knew that these people would have their identities found anyway because there were so many people looking at it. So we thought we'd focus on the actually more difficult task of kind of untangling all this imagery to figure out much more clearly how the day progressed and
the narrative timeline
violence came from.
Yeah. Now, most of your work necessarily is involved scrutiny of governments and their nefarious actions. Have you done much on corporations? Can you get access to their databases? There are major corporations we know have been trying to buy journalists, for example, to protect themselves in litigation about toxic substances. We've been victims ourselves of that.
I mean, we've done a bit of work. I mean, one thing we did was expose the illegal sale of chemicals to Syria. I think it was from Belgium that was happening, and then also in the Netherlands. And we worked with the Syrian archive and a Belgian newspaper to help expose that. And that led to the kind of managing directors getting jailed and fined because it was quite a serious violation. So there's sometimes it kind of pops up in the kind of investigations that we're doing, but it's not been really something we've done a lot of focus on because we know there's other organizations out there who do really good work on that anyway. And sometimes people come to us saying, oh, I've got this about this, and then because we're kind of networked to all these different organizations, we're saying, well, they're actually probably going to be better at doing the investigation than we would be. So we don't want to, and sometimes stuff like that isn't very good good to investigate when it comes to kind of the open source work that we do, because partly it's because so often it's been focused on conflict in the past. We're good at doing stuff related to conflict zones, but when it comes to kind of that more document focused work, we don't have the same experience as groups like the Organized Crime and Corruption Reporting Project, for example. So we kind of point them in that direction rather than trying to basically end up doing a bad job with the thing that they care about.
I thought we're coming towards the end, so I suppose a pertinent question would be time for a public service announcement. How do you fund yourself?
So, I mean, initially I launched Bellingcat with a Kickstarter, and I was always looking for kind of grants, but they would never give you any grants if you didn't have any money. So it's this kind of chicken and egg thing, but crowdfunding has kind of solved that. We kind of doubled our turnover, from just, every year since we've launched. So now We've got 20 staff members. We're a foundation in the Netherlands. We're a charitable foundation as well. And our income is about 30% comes from workshops that we offer now online rather than in person. We probably get 10 to 15% from individual donations. And that's through Patreon and just directly through our website. And kind of the rest of that is then made up with various organizations who sponsor us. And this is all listed on our website. If you go to bellingcat.com/about, we have all our funders listed. Because we audit every year, we have the results of our yearly audit as well. And that was actually intentional, because as we get accused of being the CIA and MI6 all the time, and taking money from these people and that people, but we have it all on our website, who we're funded by, how our funding is broken down in quite a detailed matter, and how that's actually spent as well, because we have to be transparent as part of the regulations in the Netherlands for a foundation. But we kind of purposely chose that to be that structure, because we'd be forced not only to have that, but also the governance structure. That means that I am part of a board of directors, not the boss of Bellingcat, and we have a supervisory board that makes sure that what we say we're doing as an organization, that we're sticking to, and that we have to constantly be reporting up to them about stuff that's happening, like questions of the ethical issues, for example, that we brought up earlier. So we were always very keen on having a very clear governance structure and being as transparent as reasonable about who funds us and how our money is actually spent and what our activities are.
Well, I think we're coming to the end. I should thank you very much from the Foreign Press Association. And we hope that we can arrange some workshops, particularly for US journalists and for foreign journalists here and abroad. With your behalf, we can work together on this and do the Lord's work, as it were. On Friday, in a sort of related zone at 11 o'clock, we have a lawyer who has been an amicus curiae for the ICC case on the Middle East. We're speaking on, that's Friday at 11 o'clock. As you know, it's controversially just been accepted by the ICC that they're going to investigate this. And whether or not the state of Palestine is recognized or not. And then a week on Thursday, on the 18th, we have old friend Christopher Gunness, who is Burmese, used to be the BBC correspondent at the UN and Asia Director of Human Rights Watch, speaking about what's happening in Myanmar, which is obviously a suitable case for treatment by Bellingcat if you have a sufficient community of Burmese speaking operatives prepared to go. But thank you very much, everybody, for being here. Thank you very much indeed to Eliot for, I think, something that puts professional journalists to shame, but that's because you've had the freedom to do it. You've had a freelancer's freedom to investigate what you want rather than what editors and advertisers want you to. So once again, on behalf of the Foreign Press Association in New York, thank you all for coming. Keep in touch. We want to keep up this good work. And is there a better time than during a semi-lockdown to do your investigative work from home with your computer? Call Eliot. He'll tell you how you can fight terminal boredom during your lockdown. Thank you very much, everybody.